The road at Thermopylae was so narrow that men died where they stood. Behind that strip of earth waited all of Greece. Ahead of it came Xerxes, ruler of an empire so vast it looked less like an army than a moving season. And in the gap stood a Spartan king with a force too small to win. The real question was never whether Leonidas could stop Persia forever. It was why he chose a stand that told the biggest empire on earth, "You do not own us." That is why his story refuses to die. Not because he conquered the world, but because he showed what a free people looks like when power demands a kneeling. The legend makes it sound simple. 300 Spartans, one mad king, one glorious last stand. The truth is sharper than the legend. Leonidas did not walk into Thermopylae chasing death for its own sake. He walked there because every road behind him led to Greek cities still arguing, still hesitating, still deciding whether they were nations or future provinces. If that line broke too soon, Athens would stand exposed. The fleet at Artemisium would lose its shield. Southern Greece would open like an unlocked gate. So before Leonidas became the man at the pass, he had to be made by the hardest city in Greece. Sparta did not raise its rulers to be charming. It raised them to endure hunger, pain, silence, and shame longer than other men could endure daylight. Leonidas was born into the Agiad royal house, but he was not the obvious future king. He grew up as a younger son, close enough to power to feel its weight, not close enough to expect it. That mattered. A man raised for duty often sees the throne differently from a man raised to inherit it. He would have known the discipline every Spartan male was expected to learn. The city prized obedience so intensely that even kings moved inside old rules. Sparta was not a place built for comfort. It was a military society balanced on fear, especially fear of the enslaved Helot population beneath it. Everything in Spartan life pointed toward control. Control of the body, control of desire, control of speech, control of fear. That discipline gave Sparta its reputation. It also gave Sparta its blindness. Because a state that worships hardness begins to believe hardness is the answer to every question, Leonidas would carry that strength and that danger into history. By the time he rose to the throne, Sparta had already become one of the leading powers in Greece. But Greece itself was not one country. It was a patchwork of proud city-states, each jealous of the others, each convinced it understood freedom better than its neighbors. Sparta led by land. Athens was rising at sea. Corinth, Thebes, Argos, and others watched, bargained, and remembered old grudges. Even in the shadow of invasion, Greek unity was fragile. That would be one of Xerxes' greatest advantages before he ever crossed into Europe. Leonidas became king after the death of his half-brother Cleomenes. He also married Gorgo, Cleomenes' daughter, tying power and bloodline together inside the royal house. Gorgo mattered more than many later retellings admit. Ancient writers remembered her as intelligent, politically aware, and unafraid to speak clearly in a world of men. So when Leonidas took the Spartan throne, he did not inherit peace. He inherited a Greek world still living in the aftershock of Marathon. A decade earlier, the Persians had tried to punish Athens and Eretria. At Marathon, the Athenians had shocked them by winning. That victory became a dangerous comfort. Many Greeks could now tell themselves Persia had been beaten already. But Marathon had not ended the threat. It had humiliated a great king, and empires do not forget humiliation. Then came Xerxes, son of Darius, with more resources, more preparation, and a larger aim. He was not raiding Greece. He was coming to subdue it. He built his invasion like an act of inevitability. Bridges were thrown across the Hellespont, and the machinery of empire rolled west. An army advanced by land. A fleet shadowed the coast. Supplies, engineers, commanders, and subject peoples moved together under one imperial will. Persia was not chaos. It was organization on a scale the Greek world could barely match. That matters because Leonidas was not facing a savage horde from a movie. He was facing one of the most sophisticated states on earth. And Persia had a simple political language: submit, send earth and water, and live under the king. For some cities, that bargain made sense. Survival is persuasive when an empire is standing on your shoreline. For Sparta and Athens, the demand was harder to swallow. Submission would not just mean taxes or tribute. It would mean admitting that the last word over Greek life belonged somewhere else. Somewhere far away at the pleasure of a great king. That is what made this more than a border war. It was a test of whether fiercely independent cities could act together before it was too late. The Greeks chose a narrow strategy because they had narrow options: hold the land route at Thermopylae and the sea route at Artemisium at the same time. If both lines held, Persia's numbers would matter less. The terrain would make a smaller force dangerous. Thermopylae was not a random choice. In its ancient shape, it squeezed movement between mountain and sea. A huge army could not fully spread there. The pass forced men to fight in a smaller mouth of ground where discipline mattered more than mass. Leonidas was chosen to lead the land defense. That alone tells you how serious the mission was. But even then, Sparta moved under ritual limits. The Carnea festival and the Olympic season restricted a full Spartan mobilization. So Leonidas marched north with an advance force, not the entire Spartan army. The famous 300 were his royal guard, not the whole Greek defense. They came with helots. They came with allies. They came as the hard center of a wider coalition. Other Greeks joined from city-states that understood exactly what would happen if Persia broke through. Men from Thespiae, Thebes, Phocis, Corinth, and elsewhere took their places. That is one of the first truths the legend hides. Leonidas did not stand alone, and Sparta did not save Greece by itself. But leadership matters, and everyone at Thermopylae knew who the center was. The Spartan king set the tone of the defense before the first Persian arrived. When the Greeks reached the pass, they repaired an old wall already there. Even that image says something about the moment. They were not building a road to victory. They were bracing a door. Somewhere behind them, politicians argued, cities calculated, and civilians waited for news. Somewhere ahead, Xerxes kept coming. You can almost feel the contrasts. On one side, empire with its endless manpower, wealth, and certainty. On the other, a coalition held together by fear, stubbornness, and a shared suspicion that if they bent once, they would bend forever. Leonidas understood theater as well as tactics. A king at the front could make wavering allies believe the stand was real. And it had to look real. If the Greeks acted like Thermopylae was only a token gesture, the whole alliance might crack. So the Spartans combed their hair, as later tradition loved to remember. They carried themselves with that unnerving calm Spartan culture had trained into them. To the Persians, it may have looked absurd. To the Greeks, it looked like resolve made visible. Xerxes eventually reached the pass and saw the line in front of him. He also saw something more troubling than numbers. He saw men who did not appear frightened enough, men who were outmatched and still behaving as if the burden of proof rested on Persia. According to later tradition, when asked to surrender their weapons, Leonidas answered with defiance. Whether the exact words were spoken matters less than the mood behind them. Because this is what Leonidas was really saying with his presence. If submission is the price of survival, then survival is not enough. That idea was larger than Sparta. It was the idea Athens needed, Corinth needed, and every uncertain Greek city needed. Still, ideas do not hold a pass by themselves. Men do. When battle began, the Persian advantage should have been overwhelming. More troops, more depth, more commanders, more room for replacement. Yet the pass kept turning numbers into congestion. Persians could reach the Greek line, but not drown it the way they could on open ground. Here the hoplite style mattered. Heavy armor, large shields, close order, and brutal discipline transformed a narrow front into a moving wall. The Spartans were not superhuman. They were trained harder and longer than most of the men coming against them. And Leonidas understood exactly how to use that. He rotated men, used the terrain, and made the Persians pay for every attempt to break through. Wave after wave came forward. Wave after wave found the same hard answer. Ancient accounts emphasize the failure of elite Persian troops to crack the position. Whether every detail is exact, the larger truth is clear. The pass worked. For 2 days the Greeks held. That fact alone matters more than any romantic embellishment. A smaller force, properly placed, stopped the momentum of imperial advance. Some men at Thermopylae were fighting for Sparta's code. Others were fighting for their own cities, families, and shrines. Leonidas had to make all those motives stand in one line. That may have been his greatest skill. He did not have time to turn Greece into one nation. He only had to convince enough Greeks to stand like one for a few critical days. And for a moment, he succeeded. The empire that expected obedience found resistance instead. You can imagine what that did to morale across Greece. If Persia could be held here, maybe it could be beaten somewhere else. That was the real power of Thermopylae, even before the final stand. It was proof that Xerxes could be delayed, bloodied, and denied speed. And speed mattered. Every extra day bought time for decisions, evacuations, ship movements, and nerve. This is where Leonidas becomes more than a battle commander. He becomes a hinge between panic and resistance. A weaker leader might have seen the odds and chosen a safer retreat before the trap began. A reckless one might have wasted his men in open ground. Leonidas did neither. He picked the one place where limited numbers could mean something and then forced the world's greatest empire to answer him there. That does not make him flawless. It makes him formidable. Because the same code that gave Leonidas his iron calm also narrowed his imagination. Spartan honor was magnificent in a crisis and dangerous after the crisis changed. The past could hold until it could not. That was always true. Thermopylae depended on geography, discipline, and secrecy. Break one of those, and the whole design could collapse in a morning. There was a mountain path around the position. Leonidas knew it existed, and Greeks were posted to guard it. But narrow plans leave little room for failure. When one piece slips, the cost can become total. Somewhere around the middle of this story, that is the question worth asking. Was Leonidas great because he refused to yield, or because he knew exactly how long a stand like this could matter? And if you had been there, would you have wanted him as your king? Or would you have wanted a man more willing to bend and live? Let me know in the comments. Because what happened next is where legend and tragedy truly locks together. A Greek named Ephialtes is remembered as the man who revealed the mountain path to Xerxes. Ancient accounts differ in tone, and later retellings turned him into the face of betrayal. Whether the Persians learned the route from one traitor alone or from broader reconnaissance, the effect was the same. The shield wall was about to be turned. Once that path was compromised, Thermopylae stopped being a gate and became a trap. The Greeks could still fight, but they could no longer block the road. News reached Leonidas that Persian forces were moving behind him. This was the moment when strategy ended and character took over. Now came the choice that made him immortal. Retreat with the coalition and preserve more men, or stay and turn defeat into a signal. Most of the Greek force was dismissed or withdrew. That decision, too, tells us Leonidas was not simply drunk on death. He did not order everyone to perish with him for the sake of spectacle. He allowed the larger war to continue. But he did remain, and with him stayed the 300 Spartans. Helots remained too, though the legend rarely gives them faces. And not only Spartans stayed, men from Thespia are remembered for choosing to remain voluntarily, while the Theban presence was more complicated. That matters because Thermopylae was never just one city's story. It was a coalition sacrifice, even if Sparta claimed the brightest torch in memory. Still, Leonidas was the center of that final circle. Once he stayed, the act became royal, political, and symbolic all at once. Some ancient tradition says an oracle had foretold that either Sparta would lose a king or be destroyed. Maybe Leonidas believed it. Maybe later Greeks needed him to. Either way, the idea fits the man history preserves, a king shaped by Spartan duty, choosing to spend his own life instead of his city's future. And that is where his fatal flaw shows its face. Leonidas could measure terrain, men, and morale with cool precision, but he belonged to a culture that treated yielding as spiritual defeat. For Sparta, retreat was not just tactical, it was moral. That belief made Spartans terrifying opponents. It also made adaptation harder once the world refused to stay inside their rules. So Leonidas did what Sparta had trained him to do. He held. On the final day, the battle spilled beyond the first neat geometry of the pass. The defenders fought in a wider, harsher crush. This was no longer about maintaining an elegant line. It was about slowing the flood with bodies, shields, and stubbornness. Leonidas was killed in the fighting. The exact details are wrapped in ancient storytelling, and some dramatic scenes were almost certainly polished by later memory. But the central fact is solid. The Spartan king died where he had chosen to stand. After his fall, the remaining defenders pulled back to a small hill. There, they made their last resistance under a storm they could not survive. Thermopylae was lost. The road into central Greece lay open. And yet this is where the story becomes bigger than victory and defeat. Because Persia won the ground, but Leonidas won the meaning. Xerxes could advance south, yes. Athens would soon be evacuated and then burned. Temples would smoke. Cities would tremble. the empire would seem, for a moment, unstoppable again. But Thermopylae had changed the emotional map of the war. Greece had seen that the Persian advance was not invincible. That matters in war more than people admit. Armies fight with muscle, but nations endure with imagination. Leonidas gave the Greeks an image they could carry into every argument afterward: a king who had not fled, a past that had not opened cheaply. Athens still had to save itself at sea. Sparta and its allies would still have to face Persia again on land. Thermopylae did not win the war. It bought time and belief for people who still could. And here, the deeper irony appears. Leonidas became eternal because he lost in the right way at the right time. Had he survived by retreating, he might have been called prudent. He would not have become a standard. Had he died in a pointless gesture with no larger effect, he would have been forgotten by all but antiquarians. Instead, his stand landed between utility and myth. That middle ground is where legends grow, useful enough to matter, dramatic enough to remember. Soon after, the Greek world would answer Persia again. The naval struggle at Salamis and the later victory at Plataea would prove that Thermopylae had not been a funeral for freedom. It had been a prelude, a brutal, necessary, unforgettable prelude. Leonidas never saw those victories. He never saw Persia checked, or Athens rise into a new age, or his own name turn into an emblem. That is part of the tragedy. Men who become symbols rarely live to control the symbol. And symbols simplify. The simplification of Leonidas has been enormous. The movies gave many people a fantasy version of Sparta, all bronze muscles and pure heroism. Real Sparta was harsher, narrower, and built on domination at home. Its military brilliance rested on an enslaved labor force. Its famous discipline came with severe social control. If we turn Leonidas into nothing but a perfect action hero, we miss the tension that makes him interesting. He was brave within a brutal system. He defended Greek independence while ruling a city that denied freedom to many under its own power. History loves that kind of contradiction because human beings are made of it. Yet contradiction does not cancel courage. Leonidas still faced a force larger than his own and chose resistance when submission was available. That is why he lasts. Not because he was morally simple, but because he was clear in the one moment that demanded clarity. There is also another correction worth making. The phrase 300 Spartans survives because it is clean, memorable, and dramatic. But the men of Thespia deserve memory too. So do the other Greeks who fought at the pass, and the Helots whose presence the old heroic version pushes to the edge. Leonidas shines brightest when the wider picture is restored, not reduced. Great leaders matter most in the company they can persuade to stand. And he did persuade them. For those days at Thermopylae, the Greeks stopped being a squabbling mosaic and became a wall. Not an permanent wall, not even a successful wall in the immediate sense, but a wall strong enough to teach the Greek world what refusal looked like, a wall that said empire could be resisted before empire reached your doorstep. That is the empire they would not bow to, not because Persia was uniquely monstrous, but because accepting foreign mastery would change the soul of their political world. For Leonidas, that was the line. Once crossed, everything else would follow. The farms would still exist. The temples might still stand. People would still wake, trade, marry, pray, and bury their dead. But they would do it under another master's will. For men like Leonidas, that was a quieter kind of death. So he chose the louder one. And even now, more than 2,000 years later, his name survives because he understood something modern people still understand instantly. There are moments when the practical question is not enough. Sometimes people ask not, can we win? But what happens to us if we refuse to stand at all? That is the heartbeat under the bronze. That is why school children remember him, why soldiers invoke him, and why filmmakers keep returning to the pass. Not because he beat the empire. He did not. Because he denied it something emperors crave almost as much as territory: consent. In that sense, Leonidas did not merely die at Thermopylae. He staged a refusal so unforgettable that the victors could not control the story afterward. Persia marched through the gate. Greece remembered the men who stood in it. And memory is a strange kind of battlefield. Sometimes the side that loses the ground keeps the last word. Leonidas kept it because his stand carried both greatness and warning. Courage can save a people, but pride can also corner a people until death feels like the only honorable choice. That is the price of hard civilizations. They produce men capable of astonishing endurance, then ask those men to pay for the system with their lives. Leonidas paid it in full, and the world has been retelling the invoice ever since. If you enjoyed this story, leave a like. It really helps more people find these histories when we bring them to life this way. And subscribe if you want more rulers, conquerors, and impossible decisions told with all the drama they deserve. Then tell me in the comments which figure you want next. Another Spartan, a Persian king, an Athenian mastermind, or someone from a completely different empire. Because the age of Leonidas was filled with giants, and some of the most important of them never fought like Spartans at all. Some won with fleets, some won with patience, some ruled by fear, and some by vision. But all of them were trying to answer the same question Leonidas faced at the pass. What do you do when power demands more than obedience? Keep that question in your mind, because after Thermopylae the war did not end. It shifted. The mountains had spoken. Next, the sea would decide whether Greece would live free or sink beneath the weight of empire.